Okay. So my name is Richard Schwartz. I was born in Harare in 1954, I think in the Lady Chancellor nursing home. I'm one of three siblings. Eve is 3 years older than me, and Pam, who sadly passed away in October 2013, was 2 years younger than me. Our folks, our dad, Joss, was born in Bulawayo in 1921, and our mother, Minerva, was born in the Orange Free State in a town called Rhodesia. Her mother was also born in the Orange Free State, I think in Frankfurt, but her family came from Palestine. My mother, Minerva's father's family was originally from Russia, but he grew up in Brooklyn and must have been one of the very few Jews who made the decision to go from America to South Africa in the early 20th century.
But when you say they were from Palestine, Rich, what period was that? Do you know?
I think that was in the 19th century. I mean, one strand of that family came from Romania, but my great-great-grandfather was a Dayan in Sfat, so I think they'd been there for a long time. I don't know what drove them. Well, I suppose, like most people, what drove them to South Africa was the opportunity for something better. My mother's mother's father, so my mother's grandfather, was a sofer in Israel. When he went to South Africa, he became a farmer, and a not very successful one, and a rather bitter one, from what I gather. My dad's family, both his parents came from Vaslui, as far as I know. Like a lot of the Romanians who ended up in Zimbabwe, they followed, I believe it was Charlie Solomon, who was the first person from Vaslui to go out. And then he brought out his landsmen, and he gave them jobs, and then they moved on in their own way. There's one thing I'm not clear about, actually. One story has it that my grandfather was heading to Buenos Aires and got off the boat in Cape Town. I'm not sure if that's true or if that was always planned, because we do have some family in Argentina.
I think Fina Rosen mentions Solomon as being one of the anchors that people came up.
I think that's right. Yeah. So we grew up in Salisbury, lived there. I lived there until I was 19. I went to Avondale and then Mount Pleasant. I did go to three different nursery schools. I remember going to Salmon Margolis and having iced Marie biscuits, lying on little green camper beds. I was at Mrs. McGillnick's nursery school for a bit. And then I ended up at Mrs. Reeves' nursery school. I've no idea why I changed so much. Either I was unhappy or I was naughty. I have no idea. Avondale, I have very few memories other than that it was good. I was happy there. Mount Pleasant was where things started to go off the rails. Had a good first year, and then we got a new headmaster who I hated and rebelled against to some extent, until in my O-level year, my father threatened to send me to St. George's, and then I sort of pulled myself together. After school, I spent 6 months at university in Rhodesia and then went to the UK. The last time I was there was 1975, and then I didn't go back again until after independence because I didn't want to go into the army. Since then, I studied in the UK. I studied law, didn't want to become a lawyer, so I became a teacher, and then lived in Greece for 3 years, and then France for 5 years, and then came back to the UK to go back to university in 85.
What did you study?
I studied international relations. I did a postgrad diploma in international and comparative politics, and then I did a PhD, which took forever. So I finished it in '97. I was doing it part-time. And at that stage, I also moved from being a teacher to being a journalist over a period of 2 or 3 years, doing a bit of each. But then in the I'd given up the teaching by the early 90s. I got married in '89 to Lisa, who's from New York. We met in Vienna. Our relationship blossomed in Paris. And we met at a conference, a UN conference, I can't remember what it was called exactly, but it was something like UN NGO conference on the question of Palestine. And we represented different arms of the same little left-wing Jewish group that supported the idea of 2 states, which then was radical, now is not so much. Any direction you want to?
Well, you then had 2 children.
I had 2 children, Ethan and Eliana. Ethan lives in London. He was like, as I was in Harare, he became involved in Habonim, and he was the Mazkir of Habonim in the UK. He now works for an organization called Yachad, which has nothing to do with Eli Yishai's party. I hasten to add, it's the other end of the political spectrum. Eliana's just finishing a degree at Bennington in Vermont.
And Rich, you've been going back to Zimbabwe since independence very regularly.
Yeah. I've got a Zimbabwean passport, which I got mainly just out of pig-headedness, and I've kept it. And I go back at least once a year, usually. And when I go back, it doesn't take more than 10, 15 minutes to feel at home, I have to say.
Even though there's hardly any of the community left.
Pardon?
Even though there's hardly any of the community left.
Yeah, but even when I go, I do tend to go to shul when I go back. And I always sit in the same seat, and it doesn't feel like, although it's very, very dwindling in terms of numbers, it still feels quite comfortable. I mean, I do have some friends there, a few friends who I have from the old days.
Can you talk a bit more about your parents and what they did with your dad?
Yeah. My dad, Joss, started a pharmaceutical company with Jerry Graham. Jerry was the pharmacist, he was the business guy. The company was Caps. It grew quite big. He retired in about 76, I think, and soon thereafter moved to Cape Town for a few years. They lived in Sea Point, in a flat called Punta del Mar, which the one time I visited seemed to be almost entirely populated by ex-Rhodesians. Then in 1980, I think they moved to Atlanta, where they were hoping to find a program which would help Pam, who had Williams syndrome, to develop. And they stayed there for 9 years and eventually moved to the UK, because by that stage, Eve had been here all that time. I'd been here, I was living here, and Pam wanted to come and live here, so they followed. And they both, my dad died in 1995 in the UK. Minerva, our mom, died in 2004, also in the UK. They had a lot of friends who were from Rhodesia originally, who they'd see. Arthur Graham was in London for a while. I know they used to see Bill and Sarah Margolis quite a lot. So and I don't get a sense that my father ever had a great nostalgia for going back to Zimbabwe. No, he was quite happy to stay in London. He had a sister, Dorothy, who lived in the UK and had been in the UK almost since the war, I think. Dorothy was a good friend of Doris Lessing, and I think they may have come over together.
Right. Can you talk a bit about your parents and the community, and also your experience of growing up in the Jewish community in Salisbury?
Sure. They were involved in committees and stuff, but they weren't. I don't think they were major players in communal affairs. I know my dad was president of the congregation a couple of times. My mom was involved in UJW, Union of Jewish Women, and WITSO to some extent. My grandfather, David Schwartz, I think, was more involved. He was one of the founders of Wingate. And I went to Wingate Sports Club last time I was there, and there was still a picture of him in the golf club, which is the only building still being used. I used to go to Wingate on Saturday afternoons. My dad used to play bowls. I can't actually remember when I stopped going to Wingate. I suppose it was early teens. I wasn't much of a tennis player, so although my mum tried to encourage me, I sort of hung out by the pool more than on the tennis court. In terms of my own involvement with the community, as a kid I was reasonably religious. I went to the children's services. I took the children's services. I was reasonably good at Hebrew. I remember the names of all my Hebrew teachers, I think. There were a mixed bunch. There was Zipporah Cohen was the one I remember first, and I remember being in love with her when I was in kindergarten. There was a Mr. Silman, who was weird. Mr. Kolsky, who had an accent that we used to take the mickey out of. Mr. Harare is the one I remember mostly, Mordechai Harare, who we used to torment by bringing German pencils into the Hebrew class so that he would smash them up under if he saw you with a German pencil, he'd take the pencil and break it in pieces and crush it under the desk leg. So that was entertainment for a while.
You were in Habonim, of course?
I was in Habonim. I was active in Habonim all the way through. I think I was Sigan Bakoach one year. I left, I can't remember if it was upper sixth or soon thereafterwards. I did go on Hadracha, but at some point around then I decided that all nationalism was bad. And I decided that Zionism was consequently bad. And we had an exchange of letters, and I sort of drifted away from that and remained not particularly interested in Israel or Zionism for quite a long time after that. Though I did soften again when I started going back. I can't remember why I started going back. I think it was journalism, actually, that took me there.
To Israel?
To Israel, yeah. I did go once as a representative of a group of NGOs on the fact-finding mission. And one thing I forgot to mention was that when I think it was 1989, I was involved in this organization called the IJPU, which eventually fell apart, as most little left-wing Jewish groups do. But as a result of that, when Yasser Arafat came to Paris, he was invited by Mitterrand, and I was living there at the time. I was invited to go and meet him because they needed a group of, fuzzy Jewish liberals to go and meet Arafat, because there were big demonstrations against him. And so we went to this hotel at 2 o'clock in the morning. Eventually he came in and we sat around and chatted, and someone asked him how he felt about the big demonstration against him, and his comment was that was nothing compared to the size of the demonstration against him in Tehran the previous Friday. So the other thing I remember about him is he had very soft hands for a man in military uniform.
His handshake was very soft.
His hair, yeah, and his skin on his hands was very sort of manicured and didn't look like he'd been holding a lot of guns. That's
How would you summarize your growing up in what was Rhodesia and now Zimbabwe, and having spent so many years visiting and seeing all that transition? How would you summarize all that?
a bit conflicted. It's difficult to say. I don't think I've got a very coherent explanation. I was very happy to see the back of Ian Smith and Rhodesia. However, clearly had over-optimistic expectations about what Mugabe was going to do. And if I look back at the kinds of things that ZANU was saying at that time, and then ZANU-PF, I should probably have been a bit more, I should have had my eyes a bit more open about the potential for liberation in the biggest sense of the word, with people actually being free. Unfortunately, the way it's gone, yes, there are some aspects of life that which feel freer, but generally it's pretty sad to see what's happened to Zimbabwe. Though I still love it, and whenever I go back, I still feel quite at home. Growing up there was a strange mixture of things. On the one hand, people who read Abo's When We column know that there were certain freedoms that you had there, just in terms of physical space and running around and being barefoot and the way you played, that are very difficult to replicate. On the other hand, as you moved up as I moved up towards my late teens, I found it increasingly suffocating. Partly the politics, but also just the social environment was very constricting, I felt. And I was, getting to a rebellious hippie stage. So I enjoyed leaving. But then after independence, when I'd sort of forgotten about the country to a large extent, and I saw something on TV, I think I was living in France at the time, and I saw the independence celebrations, and then suddenly I felt a pull. So I went back in 81 and got a passport and re-established residence. But I haven't actually lived there since independence. I was there. Lisa and I were there in 1991 for 6 months while I was finishing my PhD, which was on Zimbabwe's foreign policy.
Right. And you're happy in the UK?
Yeah, happy in the UK. Happy in London. I don't think I've ever there isn't any country other than Zimbabwe that I really relate to. I do relate to cities. So I'm very happy in London. I was very happy in Paris. I love New York, where Lisa's from. I enjoyed living in Athens. But once you get outside the capital city or the big cities like that, I don't really feel particularly, I certainly don't feel English. I mean, I suppose I would accept being called British now if someone said, people say in the UK, so people in the States might say I have a British accent, and I don't correct them. So,
and Rich, you did go back to Vaslui. You went on a short visit?
I went back to Vaslui in 2004. I had to go to Bucharest for a conference, and I decided I'd go and see Vaslui, which was 5 hours by train from Bucharest. I found a hotel on the internet, booked it, and then when I got there, I said to the receptionist in the hotel, "Have you got a guidebook?" And she sort of smiled and said, "Well, you see that road there? Walk down there, walk back, and that's Vaslui," which was almost true. I mean, it is a bit of a one-horse town. I did find the Jewish cemetery. It was closed, and there was a number on the gate, painted number, and I phoned the number, and I got through to a guy who didn't speak any of the languages that I spoke, but he just spoke Romanian. But we managed to communicate, and he came and met me at the gate and showed me around the cemetery. I found a few Schwartzes, a few Hershkowitzes, and a Gruber, I think I found there.
Leons? Any Leons?
Didn't find any Leons, was looking for Leons.
Yeah.
Because that's, in fact, when I went back to, the next time I was in Harare, I spoke to Adolf Leon, who was a cousin. And I showed him, I said I'd gone to Vaslui, and I showed him where I stayed, and I showed him how I got to the cemetery. And he, having left there 60 years before, took out a piece of paper and a pen and drew a little map of how I should have gone, because there was a shortcut that I missed.
Mm.
But in fact, it's a small town. It's a town that I think they did, they were good, they were wise to leave. So I don't regret not growing up in Vaslui.
Okay. Anything else you want to add?
No, I don't think so. Not until you've switched off the camera, and then I'll think of a whole lot of things to add. Other than that, a lot of the people you interviewed already did loom large in my life when I was young, and they were friends of my folks. So, Mervyn and Joyce, for example, Nick and Nellie Aladeff, Edgar and Joyce Cole. These are all people who, I remember very well and very fondly.
Mm.
And that's probably a nice note on which to end.
Okay. Thanks, Rich. Thanks.
Okay, sure thing.